The bullet shattered the stagecoach window 3 seconds before Clara Whitmore's life changed forever. Glass exploded across her face as armed riders surrounded the coach, screaming demands she couldn't understand through the chaos. Her fingers clutched the leather satchel, the maps her murdered father died protecting, while the driver collapsed beside her with blood spreading across his chest. Outside, a stranger with dead eyes watched from the shadows, calculating whether to walk away or break 6 years of careful isolation. That choice would ignite a war across the Wyoming frontier and prove that some battles choose you, whether you're ready or not. If you want to see how far desperation can push ordinary people into extraordinary violence, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Wyoming Sun had beaten Dry Creek into submission by the time Ethan Crow rode into town on a horse that looked as tired as he felt. Dust clung to everything. The buildings, the people, the hope that maybe used to live here before the land crushed it out of them. 6 years of drifting across territories where nobody asked questions had taught Ethan exactly 3 things. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and never stay anywhere long enough for people to remember your face. He tied his horse outside Morrison's trading post and checked the street out of habit. Empty except for a few ranch hands drinking away their wages and an old woman sweeping sand that would blow back before she finished. Perfect. He'd buy ammunition, coffee, and whatever jerky didn't smell like death, then disappear north before sunset. The trading post smelled like leather and tobacco. Morrison stood behind a counter that had seen better decades, sorting through invoices with the enthusiasm of a man counting his own funeral expenses. Help you? Morrison didn't look up. Ammunition, .44 caliber. Coffee, if it's not from last year. Everything's from last year. Morrison finally glanced at Ethan, and something flickered across his face, recognition trying to surface through years of forgetting. You look familiar. I don't. Ethan kept his voice flat, bored. The ammunition? Morrison studied him another moment before shrugging and turning toward the supply shelves. 44 is expensive. $3 a box. That's robbery. That's Wyoming. Morrison grabbed 2 boxes and dropped them on the counter with a sound like bones rattling. Continental Cattle controls the freight lines now. Everything costs more when one company owns the territory. Ethan said nothing. Politics were quicksand. You stepped in, you drowned. He counted out coins while Morrison wrapped the ammunition in brown paper, and that's when the screaming started outside. Not panic screaming, terror screaming, the kind that comes from people who know they're about to die. Ethan's hand moved toward his revolver automatically before he stopped himself. Not your problem, not anymore. He'd made that decision 6 years ago when he walked away from the homestead, from the blood on the porch, from the failure that killed his father. Getting involved meant caring, and caring meant staying, and staying meant dying like everyone else who thought the frontier gave a damn about justice. But his feet carried him to the window anyway. The stagecoach came down Main Street like something fleeing hell itself. The driver was slumped forward, reins tangled in his hands, while the horses ran wild with foam flying from their mouths. One of the coach doors hung broken on its hinges, swinging with each bounce across the rutted road. Passengers were screaming inside. Ethan could see hands pressed against the windows, faces white with fear. Behind the coach, 5 riders came hard and fast. They wore no badges, no uniforms, nothing identifying them as law. Just men with rifles and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from knowing nobody will stop you. The lead rider fired a shot into the air, and the coach horses screamed and veered wildly, smashing into a water trough and nearly overturning. Christ, Morrison whispered beside Ethan, that's Continental's men. The coach finally stopped in a chaos of dust and panicked horses. The door flew open and passengers stumbled out. An older couple, a young man in a suit, and then a woman who caught Ethan's attention in a way that felt dangerous. She was Eastern. You could tell from the traveling clothes that weren't built for frontier dust, the way she moved like someone used to paved streets instead of mud. Dark hair pulled back but coming loose, face pale but set with the kind of determination that gets people killed out here. She clutched a leather satchel against her chest like it contained her entire life. Maybe it did. The riders surrounded the coach before the passengers could run. The lead man, a thick-shouldered bastard with a scar cutting through his beard, swung down from his horse and walked straight toward the woman. Clara Whitmore. His voice carried across the street. You're making this harder than it needs to be. She backed against the coach, the satchel pressed tighter. I don't know what you want. Sure you do. Scarface smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Ethan had seen in months. The maps your daddy left you, the research, all that pretty paperwork about water rights and land surveys. Hand it over and we'll let you walk away. I don't have... The rifle stock caught her across the face before she finished lying. The sound cracked across the street like breaking wood. Clara went down hard, blood already streaming from her forehead, but somehow she kept her grip on the satchel, even while the world was probably spinning. Ethan's jaw clenched. His hand found his revolver grip without conscious thought. Walk away. This isn't your fight. This isn't your town anymore. But he didn't move. Scarface reached for the satchel, and Clara did something either incredibly brave or catastrophically stupid. She kicked him directly in the knee. The big man howled and stumbled back while Clara rolled under the stagecoach horses, scrambled to her feet on the other side, and ran. She made it maybe 20 feet before bullets started kicking up dust around her boots. The other passengers scattered. The old couple dove into the general store. The man in the suit just stood there frozen until one of the riders shoved him face first into the mud. Clara kept running, weaving between buildings with blood streaming down her face and the satchel clutched against her ribs. One of the riders spurred his horse after her, laughing like this was sport. Ethan watched Clara disappear into the alley between the saloon and the boarding house. Watched the rider follow. Counted exactly 4 seconds before making the decision that would ruin his careful isolation. He walked out of the trading post. Hey! His voice cut through the chaos. Not loud, but carrying the weight of someone who knew how to make men listen. That's enough. The riders turned. Scarface looked Ethan up and down with the slow assessment of a predator deciding if something was prey or competition. This doesn't concern you, friend. Wasn't being friendly. Ethan stopped 10 paces away, hands loose at his sides. Close enough to talk, far enough to draw. Let the woman go. Scarface laughed. You know who you're talking to. We work for Continental Cattle. That means we own this territory and everyone in it. Seems like you're having trouble with one woman and a bag of papers. The laughter stopped. Scarface's hand drifted toward his holster. Walk away while you still can. Could say the same to you. The street went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan had been in enough of these moments to know exactly how they worked. 90% fear, 10% skill, and 100% commitment to being faster than the other bastard when the shooting started. Then Morrison's voice called from the trading post doorway. Ethan Crow, that's your name, ain't it? Finally remembered. He sounded almost apologetic. You're Thomas Crow's boy, the one who disappeared after your daddy died up in the valley. Something shifted in Scarface's eyes. Recognition, calculation. The kind of look that meant Ethan's name meant something to Continental Cattle, and nothing good. Crow. Scarface rolled the name around like tasting something rotten. Heard about you. Heard your daddy thought he could fight Continental and keep his water rights. Heard how that worked out for him. Ethan's hand twitched. Every muscle in his body wanted to draw, to shoot, to make this bastard pay for the casual cruelty in his voice. But 6 years of survival screamed louder than 6 seconds of satisfaction. The woman, Ethan said quietly. Let her go. Or what? You'll shoot all 5 of us before we put you down? Scarface gestured at his men. You really that stupid? Probably. But Ethan had stopped making smart decisions the moment Clara's blood hit the dirt. The alley behind him erupted with noise. A crash, a man's shout. Then Clara burst back onto Main Street running full speed with the rider who'd chased her stumbling behind her holding his face. Blood ran between the man's fingers. Clara still had the satchel and apparently she'd used something sharp from the alley to defend herself. She saw Ethan, saw the guns, saw the situation dissolving into violence, and made a choice that surprised everyone. She ran straight toward him. Move, she shouted. Ethan moved. Grabbed Clara's arm as she reached him and pulled her toward the trading post entrance while his other hand drew his revolver. He fired once over the riders' heads, not to kill, but to scatter. The horses reared and the men scrambled for cover while Ethan shoved Clara through the trading post door. Morrison stared at them like they'd brought the apocalypse into his store. Back door, Ethan snapped. Now. This is insane. Now. Morrison pointed toward the storage room. Ethan pulled Clara through shelves of supplies and out a rear door that opened onto an alley filled with garbage and broken crates. They could hear the riders shouting in the street, organizing, preparing to search every building. Clara leaned against the alley wall, breathing hard, blood still running from the gash on her forehead. Up close, she looked younger than Ethan first thought. Maybe 25, maybe 30, but with eyes that had seen enough to age anyone. The kind of eyes that knew what loss looked like. "Thank you," she managed between breaths. Thank you." "Save it." Ethan glanced toward the street. They had maybe 2 minutes before Continental's men started kicking in doors. "What the hell did you do to make them that angry?" Clara touched her bleeding forehead and winced. "I exist, and I have something they want to keep buried. The maps." She looked surprised. "You heard? Hard to miss when someone's beating you in the middle of the street." Ethan checked his revolver, counting rounds. 4 left. Not enough for 5 men. "What's on them?" "Proof." Clara's voice steadied despite the blood and fear. "Proof that Continental Cattle has been stealing water rights across Wyoming through fraud and intimidation. Proof that independent settlers could thrive without corporate control if they knew the truth about the territory's water systems. My father spent 10 years researching it before they killed him." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. "They killed your father over maps?" "They killed him over power." Clara clutched the satchel tighter. "The maps just prove they've been doing it for decades. If this research reaches the territorial courts, Continental loses control of half of Wyoming." "So you thought riding a stagecoach into their territory was a good plan?" "I thought I could reach the Northern Valley before they caught me." She met his eyes, and there was steel underneath the fear. "The abandoned homestead near Blackwater Ridge. The property records say it belonged to a Thomas Crow who died 6 years ago. The water survey my father conducted shows that Homestead sits on one of the most valuable underground spring systems in Wyoming. If I can prove the land should never have been abandoned..." "Stop talking." Clara blinked. "What?" "That homestead." Ethan's voice came out rougher than intended. "My father's property, where he died. You want to go there?" Understanding dawned across Clara's face, along with something that might have been sympathy if Ethan was willing to see it. "You're Thomas Crow's son. The trading post owner said..." "I know what he said." Ethan turned away, checking the alley again. The riders would be here soon. Every second of this conversation was a second closer to bullets. "You can't go to that valley. It's dead land, cursed. Whatever your father's maps say, they're wrong." "My father was never wrong about water." "Your father got himself killed, like mine, like everyone who thinks they can fight Continental and win." The words came out harsher than Ethan intended, but Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, blood dripping onto her collar, eyes blazing with the kind of fury that comes from losing everything and refusing to let it mean nothing. "You think I don't know the odds?" Her voice shook but didn't break. "You think I don't know what they'll do to me if they catch me?" "I watched my father die screaming because he wouldn't surrender his research. I've been running for 6 months, sleeping in barns, hiding from men with guns who want me dead just for knowing the truth. You think I came this far because I'm naive? I think you came this far because you're desperate." "Desperate people are dangerous." Clara's smile was bitter. "Ask Continental how desperate I am when I burn their empire down with these maps." Footsteps echoed from the street, men's voices calling out orders. The search was starting. Ethan should walk away, let Clara fight her own war, disappear back into the territories where names and pasts didn't follow. 6 years of running had kept him alive specifically because he'd learned when to stay out of other people's fights. But then he looked at Clara, bleeding, defiant, clutching papers that men would kill for, and saw something he'd spent 6 years trying to forget. His father on the porch, blood spreading across the wood, eyes finding Ethan hiding behind the water barrel while Continental's men rode away laughing. The helplessness, the rage, the shame of surviving by doing nothing. "There's a stable 3 buildings east," Ethan said quietly. "Owner drinks himself unconscious every afternoon. He won't notice if we borrow horses." Clara stared at him. "You're helping me?" "I'm getting you out of town before they kill us both." Ethan started moving down the alley. "After that, you're on your own." "I need to reach the valley." "You need to stay alive long enough to run somewhere they won't find you." "If I run, my father died for nothing." Ethan stopped and turned back. If you die, he still died for nothing. At least running gives you the option to try again later. Later won't matter. Continental's already moving on the valley. They're filing territorial claims this month. If I don't prove my father's research before the courts finalize their ownership, independent settlers lose their last chance at freedom in Wyoming. The way she said it, like freedom was something real instead of a word people used before the frontier crushed them, made Ethan's chest tighten with something between anger and grief. The valley is death, he said. It killed my father. It'll kill you too. Then I'll die trying instead of running. Clara's jaw set. Are you going to help me or not? Ethan should say no. Should turn around, steal a horse, and disappear into the mountains where wars over water rights couldn't follow. Should let this Eastern woman with her murdered father's research fight her own impossible battle. Instead, he heard himself say, "The stable's this way. Stay quiet and stay close." They moved through Dry Creek's back alleys like ghosts, avoiding the main streets where Continental's riders were tearing through buildings. Ethan could hear breaking wood, shouted questions, the sounds of a town being terrorized by men who knew nobody would stop them. The stable owner was exactly where Ethan predicted, passed out in the hay with an empty whiskey bottle cradled like a lover. They took 2 horses, saddled quickly in silence, and led them out through the rear paddock into the scrubland beyond town. No one followed. Not yet. They rode hard for an hour before Ethan finally slowed the pace. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the Wyoming plains in shades of blood and gold. Behind them, Dry Creek disappeared into dust and distance. Ahead, the mountains rose like teeth waiting to chew them into pieces. Clara rode in silence, one hand pressed against her bleeding forehead, the satchel secured across her saddle. She didn't complain about the pain, didn't ask where they were going, didn't try to make conversation. Just rode with the grim determination of someone who'd already decided dying was acceptable if it meant something. Finally, as twilight began settling across the plains, Ethan pulled his horse to a stop near a creek bed lined with cottonwoods. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "No fire. Continental's men will be searching." Clara slid from her saddle and immediately sat down hard, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Blood had dried across half her face in a dark mask. Her hand shook as she opened the satchel and checked the maps inside, making sure they'd survived the violence. Ethan tended the horses while watching Clara in his peripheral vision. She moved like someone running on fumes. Exhaustion and fear held at bay only by sheer stubborn will. When she finally looked up and caught him watching, something passed between them. Not trust exactly. More like the mutual recognition of 2 people who'd both lost things they couldn't get back. "Why did you really help me?" Clara asked quietly. "In the street. You could have walked away." Ethan sat down against a cottonwood trunk, keeping distance between them. Moment of stupidity. Happens sometimes. "You knew my father's research. You knew about the valley's water systems. Everyone who worked that land knew about the water. That's why Continental wanted it so badly. Then why did they kill your father instead of just stealing the property legally?" The question hit like a punch. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Because my father wouldn't sell. Because he thought property rights and legal documents mattered more than hired guns. Because he was stupid enough to believe the law would protect him against men who owned the judges." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "My father believed the same thing. He thought exposing Continental's corruption would change everything. He thought truth mattered more than power." "How'd that work out for him?" "They shot him in his study and burned his house down. Made it look like an accident." Clara's voice stayed level, but her hands clenched around the satchel. "I only survived because I wasn't home. By the time I got back, everything was ashes except these maps." He'd hidden them in a waterproof case buried in the garden. "So, you decided to finish his suicide mission?" "I decided to make his death mean something." Clara met his eyes. "You think I don't know this will probably kill me? You think I'm naive enough to believe one woman with maps can destroy a corporation that controls half the territory? I know the odds. I just refuse to let them win without a fight." Ethan wanted to tell her that refusing didn't matter, that the frontier broke everyone eventually regardless of how hard they fought. That courage was just another word for dying slower. But he didn't say any of it. Instead, he pulled jerky from his saddlebag and handed her half. "Eat. You'll need strength for tomorrow." Clara took the food without argument. They ate in silence while the last light died and stars emerged across the enormous Wyoming sky. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other with sounds like grief. "Where will you go?" Clara asked eventually. "After you leave me at the valley. North, maybe Montana, somewhere Continental doesn't control yet. Running, surviving. There's a difference?" Ethan didn't answer because they both knew there wasn't. Running and surviving were the same thing out here. The only difference was how long you could keep doing both before the frontier caught you. Clara shifted against the tree, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. The valley's water system could support 50 families, maybe more if the irrigation channels are restored properly. My father's research shows underground springs that never run dry, even in drought years. If independent settlers knew they could thrive there without relying on Continental's water, they'd still die, Ethan cut her off. Because Continental doesn't fight with courts and property rights. They fight with bullets and burned homes. Your father's research won't save anyone if they're all dead before they can use it. So we should just surrender? Let corporations own the entire frontier? We should be realistic about what individual people can accomplish against institutional power. Clara laughed, and it was a broken sound. You sound like my father right before he decided being realistic meant being dead. He told me the night before they killed him that he was tired of being realistic, that sometimes you have to choose between survival and dignity. Dignity doesn't keep you alive. No, but it gives you a reason to stay alive. Clara looked at him across the darkness. You've been surviving for 6 years. Has it been worth it? The question landed like a knife between Ethan's ribs. He wanted to say yes, wanted to defend the choice he'd made to walk away from the homestead and the blood and the failure. Wanted to believe that 6 years of drifting meant something more than cowardice. But sitting here in the darkness with a woman who refused to run despite every rational reason to do so, Ethan couldn't find the words. Get some sleep, he said instead. We ride at dawn. Clara nodded and curled up against the tree with her satchel pillowed under her head. Within minutes, her breathing slowed into the shallow rhythm of exhaustion, finally claiming its due. Ethan stayed awake, watching the darkness, listening for sounds of pursuit that didn't come. Not yet. But they would. Continental's men wouldn't stop searching just because night fell. They'd hunt Clara across every mile of Wyoming until they got those maps or put her in the ground. And for reasons Ethan couldn't entirely explain or justify, he'd just positioned himself between her and the bullets. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot echoed across the plains, too far away to be immediate danger, but close enough to remind Ethan that violence was always waiting just beyond the firelight. He checked his revolver again. 4 rounds. Not enough for the fight that was coming. Nothing would ever be enough. Dawn broke cold and gray across the Wyoming plains, the kind of morning that promised nothing good. Ethan woke to the sound of Clara already moving, checking her horse's hooves with the methodical care of someone who understood that small mistakes out here became fatal ones. Blood still crusted dark across half her face, but her hands were steady. How's your head? Ethan asked, rolling up his bedroll. Hurts like hell. Clara didn't look up from the horse. But I can ride. They moved north through country that got progressively meaner as the sun climbed. The grasslands gave way to broken terrain carved by ancient rivers that had long since dried up or gone underground. Rocky outcroppings appeared like broken teeth, and the wind carried the smell of sage and something else, the particular emptiness of land that had killed enough people to earn a reputation. Around midday, Ethan spotted the first sign they were being followed, dust on the southern horizon. Too much for wind, too organized for wild animals. Riders moving fast, spreading out in a search pattern that would eventually intersect their trail. We've got company, Ethan said, pointing. Clara squinted against the sun. How many? Hard to say. At least 4, maybe 6. Ethan calculated distances and terrain in his head. They're tracking us, but they haven't found our exact trail yet. We've got maybe 2 hours before they close the gap. Can we outrun them? Not on these horses. Not for long. Ethan turned his mount toward a range of hills to the east. But we can lose them if we're smart about it. They rode hard for the hills, pushing the horses to the edge of what was sustainable. Behind them, the dust cloud grew closer. Continental's men were good, experienced trackers who knew this territory and had fresh mounts and no reason to show mercy when they finally caught up. The hills offered temporary cover. Ethan led them through a series of narrow ravines where the rock walls rose 30 feet on either side, and the ground was too hard to leave clear tracks. They dismounted twice to lead the horses over particularly rough sections, moving as quietly as possible while the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed somewhere behind them. "This is insane," Clara muttered, slipping on loose rock and catching herself against the canyon wall. "We can't keep running forever." "Don't need forever. Just need long enough to reach somewhere they can't follow easily." "Like where?" "The breaks." Ethan pointed north toward a region where the land looked like it had been shattered by some ancient violence. "It's a maze of canyons and dead-end valleys. Easy to lose yourself. Easier to lose the people chasing you. Or get trapped and killed." That too, and they emerged from the ravine into a landscape that looked like the earth had cracked open and forgotten to heal. Deep chasms cut through red rock, creating a network of passages that twisted back on themselves in ways that defied logic. Water had carved these channels over millennia, but now most of them were bone dry, except for the occasional stagnant pool. Ethan had been through the breaks once before, years ago, and nearly died when his horse broke a leg in a hidden crevice. The place was a natural tomb for anyone stupid enough to think they could navigate it without luck and prayer. But it was also the best chance they had. They'd been moving through the canyon system for maybe 30 minutes when the storm hit. It came from nowhere the way frontier weather did. 1 minute clear sky, the next minute the horizon turning black as ink. Thunder cracked like artillery, and the first raindrops fell hard enough to sting. "We need shelter!" Clara shouted over the rising wind. "Not here!" Ethan scanned the canyon walls, looking for high ground. Flash floods. These canyons fill up in minutes during storms. As if to prove his point, water began trickling down the rock faces around them. Small streams at first, but growing fast. Ethan cursed and spurred his horse forward, searching desperately for an exit route before the trickle became a torrent. The rain turned torrential within seconds. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Water poured off the canyon rim in sheets, and the trickle at their feet was already ankle-deep on the horses. "There!" Clara pointed at a narrow cut in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a horse. They pushed through just as the first real surge of floodwater came roaring down the main channel behind them. The sound was like a train, deep, grinding, unstoppable. Ethan caught a glimpse of brown water carrying debris and small trees, moving with the kind of force that would crush bones and drown screams. The narrow passage climbed steeply upward. The horses struggled, hooves slipping on wet rock, but the water was rising faster. They had no choice but to keep climbing or die trying. Clara's horse lost its footing on a particularly steep section. The animal went down hard, throwing Clara sideways into the rock wall. She screamed, the first time Ethan had heard her make that sound, and grabbed desperately for the reins as her horse scrambled back to its feet. But the damage was done. Clara's shoulder had hit the wall with the full force of her weight behind it. When she tried to pull herself back into the saddle, her left arm buckled and she nearly fell again. "I can't." Clara's face had gone white. "My shoulder. Hold on." Ethan dismounted and moved to her side as water surged around their ankles. He could feel the current trying to pull his feet out from under him. "Can you ride?" "I don't think." Clara tried to raise her left arm, and the pain cut off whatever she'd been about to say. She sagged against the rock wall, breathing hard through clenched teeth. The water was rising. Ethan could see it climbing the rock inch by inch, relentless. They had maybe 60 seconds before the current became too strong to stand against. He made the decision without thinking about it. Grabbed Clara around the waist, lifted her onto his horse despite her gasp of pain, and climbed up behind her. Her horse's reins he tied to his saddle, creating a line that would either save the animal or drag them all down together. "Hold on to the saddle horn," Ethan said into Clara's ear. "Use your good arm. Don't let go." They climbed. The horse fought for every foot of elevation while water tried to sweep them back into the drowning darkness below. Ethan could feel the animal's muscles straining, could hear Clara's ragged breathing as she fought to stay conscious through the pain. Behind them, the sound of water became a roar. The passage opened suddenly onto a flat shelf of rock maybe 40 feet above the canyon floor. Ethan drove the horse forward onto solid ground just as the main surge hit where they'd been standing seconds before. The water exploded upward in a geyser of brown foam, carrying everything loose and unlucky in its path. They'd made it. Barely. Ethan slid from the saddle and helped Clara down. She couldn't stand on her own. Between the head injury and the shoulder, her body was giving out. He caught her before she collapsed and lowered her to the wet rock as gently as possible. "Let me see the shoulder." Clara tried to shrug out of her coat, and the movement made her cry out. Ethan helped, careful but efficient, until he could see the injury. The shoulder was already swelling, purple spreading under the skin. Dislocated, probably. Maybe broken. Impossible to tell without proper examination, and they didn't have time for proper anything. Below them, the flood raged through the canyon system like something alive and angry. Above them, rain continued to fall in sheets. They were trapped on the shelf until the storm passed and the water receded. "There," Clara pointed with her good hand toward a dark opening in the rock face behind them. "Is that a cave?" It was. A shallow overhang that provided maybe 10 feet of shelter from the rain. Not much, but better than drowning or dying of exposure. Ethan helped Clara into the cave while the horses stood miserably in the rain outside. There was no way to get the animals under cover without risking them bolting or falling off the shelf. They'd have to endure it. Inside the cave, Ethan used his remaining dry matches to start a small fire with dead wood that had accumulated in the back corners. The smoke was thick, but at least it was warm. Clara sat against the rock wall, cradling her injured arm, face pale and drawn. "How bad?" Ethan asked, checking the shoulder again by firelight. "Bad enough." Clara's voice was tight with pain. "It's dislocated. I've done it before, back east. Fell off a horse when I was 16. Doctor said it would be weak after that. I can reset it, but it's going to hurt." "Everything already hurts." Clara managed a weak smile. "One more thing won't make much difference." Ethan had reset dislocated shoulders twice before, once on a ranch hand who'd been thrown by a bull, once on himself after a fight went wrong in Colorado. The trick was being fast and decisive. Hesitation just prolonged the agony. "On 3, Ethan said, positioning Clara's arm carefully. 1, go. He pulled on 2. The shoulder popped back into place with a sound like breaking wood, and Clara's scream echoed off the cave walls and probably carried for miles if anyone was out there listening. She doubled over, gasping, tears streaming down her face to mix with the rain and blood. But when Ethan checked again, the joint was seated properly. "You bastard," Clara managed between ragged breaths. "You said 3. If I'd said 3, you would have tensed up. Makes it harder." Ethan used strips torn from his shirt to fashion a crude sling. "Keep it immobilized for a few days. Don't try to use it, or it'll just pop out again." Clara nodded, still breathing through the pain. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Water continued to pour off the canyon rim in waterfalls that crashed into the flood below, with sounds like distant thunder. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage and feeling the temperature drop as night approached. The fire helped, but not enough. Ethan could see Clara shivering despite being closer to the flames. "Here." He moved closer and put his coat around her shoulders. "You'll freeze otherwise." Clara didn't argue. She pulled the coat tight with her good hand and leaned against the cave wall, exhausted beyond words. The firelight made shadows dance across her bruised face, and for the first time Ethan saw her as something other than a problem to be solved or an obligation to be fulfilled. She was just a woman who'd lost her father and refused to let his death mean nothing, who'd been beaten and chased and hunted across hundreds of miles but still clutched those maps like they were worth dying for. Maybe they were. "Why did you really come to Wyoming?" Ethan asked quietly. The truth this time. Clara was silent long enough that Ethan thought she might not answer. Then she said, "Because running east didn't work. I tried that first. Went to newspapers, to lawyers, to anyone who would listen. Showed them my father's research, explained what Continental was doing. You know what happened? They ignored you. Worse, they took Continental's bribes and told me to forget the whole thing. One editor actually threatened to have me arrested for libel if I kept making accusations against respected businessmen." Clara's laugh was bitter. "Respected businessmen who murdered my father and burned his life's work. So you decided to come to the source." "I decided to stop asking permission to fight back." Clara shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her shoulder. "The valley my father surveyed, your father's homestead, is the proof Continental can't bury. If I can document the water system, take samples, create a new survey that corroborates my father's original research, Then even bribed judges can't ignore it. You're betting your life on can't ignore it. I'm betting my life on the possibility that somewhere in Wyoming, there's still someone who cares about truth more than money. Clara met his eyes. Is that really so stupid? Ethan wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her that betting on human decency in a territory controlled by corporate greed was beyond stupid. It was suicidal. But sitting here in the firelight with Clara's blood on his shirt and her determination burning brighter than the flames, Ethan couldn't find the cruelty. My father thought the same thing, Ethan said instead. He thought if he could just prove Continental was stealing water rights illegally, the territorial government would step in. He filed complaints, gathered evidence, even testified at a hearing in Cheyenne. What happened? 3 weeks after the hearing, 4 men rode onto our property during dinner. They shot my father on the porch, while I hid behind a water barrel, like a coward. Then they burned the barn and rode off laughing. Ethan's voice stayed flat, emotionless. He'd told this story to himself so many times in 6 years that it didn't even hurt anymore, just existed as fact. The territorial marshal ruled it was a dispute between neighbors that got out of hand. No charges filed. Continental bought the property at auction 2 months later. But Oti. Clara was quiet for a moment. You weren't a coward. You were a kid. I was 17, old enough to fight. Old enough to die, you mean? Clara adjusted the sling carefully. If you'd tried to help him, they would have killed you too. Then nobody would be alive to remember what really happened. Memory doesn't bring justice. No. But it's where justice starts. Clara's eyes reflected firelight. Your father's memory, my father's research, all the settlers Continental has destroyed, that's the foundation we build on. That's how we make their deaths mean something. Pretty words. But Continental doesn't care about meaning. They care about power. Then we take their power away. Clara's jaw set. Piece by piece, document by document, until enough people know the truth that they can't keep controlling the narrative. Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to think that 2 people with determination and dead fathers could accomplish anything against an empire built on violence and money. But 6 years of running had taught him that belief was just another word for disappointment waiting to happen. Outside, the storm began to fade. The rain lessened to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Water still rushed through the canyons below, but the sound was quieter now, dangerous instead of apocalyptic. We should rest, Ethan said. Storm's passing. Water will recede by morning, and we can move again. They're still out there. Clara didn't phrase it as a question. Continental's men. Probably lost our trail in the flood, but they won't stop looking. Good. Clara's smile was sharp. Let them look. Let them waste time and resources hunting me. Every day I stay alive is another day closer to destroying them. Ethan added wood to the fire and settled against the opposite wall. Clara was already drifting towards sleep, exhaustion and pain finally overwhelming adrenaline. Her breathing evened out within minutes, the satchel still clutched against her chest even in unconsciousness. Ethan stayed awake listening to the water below and the silence above. Somewhere in that silence, Continental's men were regrouping, planning, preparing to resume the hunt at first light. And somewhere north, the valley waited with all its ghosts and broken promises. 6 years ago, Ethan had sworn he'd never return to that cursed land. Had promised himself that Thomas Crow's failure would be the last time the valley claimed a life that mattered. But sitting here watching Clara sleep with her father's research pressed against her heart, and her shoulder dislocated from fighting for something bigger than survival, Ethan felt that old promise cracking. Maybe some fights chose you whether you were ready or not. Maybe running just meant the frontier caught you slower. Dawn came gray and exhausted. The water had receded enough to reveal the canyon floor 40 feet below, now just muddy and littered with debris instead of actively trying to kill them. Ethan woke Clara gently, aware of her injuries, and they ate the last of the jerky in silence before preparing to move. Clara's shoulder was worse in daylight. The bruising had spread and her range of motion was severely limited. She couldn't saddle her own horse or mount without help. But she didn't complain, just gritted her teeth and did what needed doing. They descended carefully, leading the horses down slopes made treacherous by mud. It took 2 hours to reach the canyon floor and another hour to navigate out of the breaks entirely. By the time they emerged into open country again, the sun was high and merciless. How far to the valley? Clara asked, swaying slightly in her saddle. Ethan checked the horizon. 2 days? Maybe 3 at this pace. I can go faster. You can barely sit upright. Ethan kept his tone neutral. We'll make camp early tonight. Let you rest properly. Clara started to argue, then thought better of it. The exhaustion was written across her face in lines that made her look 10 years older. Fine, but we keep moving until sundown. They rode through country that grew progressively emptier. No homesteads, no travelers, no signs of human habitation except the occasional abandoned ranch, slowly being reclaimed by grass and wind. This was the frontier at its most honest, vast, indifferent, and absolutely unforgiving of weakness. Late afternoon, they spotted riders on the northern horizon. Ethan's hand moved to his revolver automatically. Get down! They dismounted and led the horses into a dry creek bed that offered minimal cover. The riders were maybe 2 miles out, moving east to west in a search pattern. Ethan counted 5 distinct figures. Is it them? Clara whispered. Can't tell from here, but I'm not betting against it. They waited in the creek bed while the riders passed slowly across their field of vision. At one point, the group stopped and one man dismounted to check the ground, looking for tracks, probably. Ethan held his breath, acutely aware that their trail from the breaks was probably visible to anyone who knew what to look for. But after a few minutes, the rider remounted and the group continued west. Either they'd missed the signs or decided following them wasn't worth the effort. They're spreading out, Ethan said once the riders disappeared over a ridge, trying to cover more ground. That means they lost us, but they know generally where we're headed. The valley. Exactly. Which means we can't approach it directly. They'll be watching the obvious routes. Clara nodded, pain evident in the tightness around her eyes. So we circle around? Come in from an unexpected direction? North through the mountains, harder riding, but they won't expect it. Ethan checked the position of the sun. We'll make camp soon. Rest while we can. They found a sheltered spot among a cluster of boulders as the sun began its descent. No fire this time, too risky with Continental's men searching the area. They ate stale bread and drank from their canteens while the temperature dropped and stars began emerging across the darkening sky. Clara struggled to find a comfortable position with her injured shoulder. Every movement brought fresh pain, but she refused the whiskey Ethan offered for it. Need my head clear, she explained. Can't afford to be slow if they find us. You're already slow. The whiskey would at least take the edge off. I've lived with pain before. Clara settled against a boulder with her good arm wrapped around her knees. After my mother died, my father worked himself nearly to death trying to finish his research. I watched him deteriorate for 3 years, watched the obsession consume him, watched him sacrifice health and happiness for maps and surveys and water tables. I kept thinking he'd stop, that eventually he'd realize no amount of knowledge was worth destroying himself. But he didn't. He did, actually, about 6 months before they killed him. Clara's voice went quiet. He told me he was done, that he'd published his findings, and it was time to let other people carry the fight. We were going to move to California, start fresh somewhere Continental didn't control. He'd already bought train tickets. What changed? A family of settlers showed up at our door. They'd been forced off their land by Continental. Their well had mysteriously run dry after they refused to sell. They had 3 children and nowhere to go. Clara's hands clenched. My father looked at those kids and he couldn't walk away. He spent the next week documenting their case, gathering evidence, preparing to file another lawsuit. That's when Continental decided he was too dangerous to let live. Ethan understood that trap. The moment you cared about someone else's suffering, you were finished. The frontier demanded you look away, stay selfish, protect only yourself. The moment you started fighting for strangers was the moment you guaranteed your own destruction. Your father should have walked away, Ethan said. Should have taken you to California and let someone else fight that battle. Probably. Clara looked at him across the darkness. But then I wouldn't have these maps. Wouldn't have any way to finish what he started. Wouldn't be here right now, preparing to burn down the people who killed him. You might also still have a father. I'd rather have a father who died fighting than one who lived by giving up. Clara's voice hardened. At least I can respect what he sacrificed for. Can you say the same about your 6 years of running? The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He wanted to snap back, to defend his choices, to explain that survival was its own form of resistance. But sitting here in the dark with a woman who dislocated her shoulder rather than surrender her father's research, Ethan couldn't find the argument. "You don't know anything about my choices," he said finally. "I know you're still alive and your father's dead. I know you ran instead of fighting. I know you've spent 6 years telling yourself that staying away from the valley means you're being smart instead of scared. Careful. Why? You going to abandon me out here?" Clara's laugh was sharp. "You've already committed to helping me reach the valley. Backing out now just proves my point." Ethan stood up, anger burning in his chest. "You want to know why I ran? Because fighting got my father killed and accomplished nothing. Because I watched him die slowly on that porch while Continental's men laughed and I hid like a coward. Because I was 17 years old and terrified and I didn't know what else to do except survive." Clara didn't flinch. "And now you're 23 and still terrified, still hiding, still letting them win. This isn't about winning. Everything's about winning." Clara struggled to her feet, using the boulder for support. "Continental wins every time someone like you decides fighting back isn't worth the risk. They win every time fear is stronger than anger. They win every time we choose survival over justice. Justice doesn't exist out here. Then we create it." Clara stepped closer, eyes blazing despite the pain and exhaustion. "We make it exist by refusing to accept anything less, by fighting even when the odds are impossible, by choosing to stand our ground instead of running the moment things get difficult. Standing your ground is how you die. Running is how you guarantee they win." Clara's voice dropped. "I'd rather die trying to change something than live knowing I accepted corruption because fighting was too hard." They stood there in the darkness, two people carrying different versions of the same grief, arguing about choices that had already been made. Ethan wanted to hate her certainty, wanted to mock her idealism as the naivety of someone who hadn't learned how the frontier really worked. But he couldn't, because despite the beating and the dislocated shoulder and the very real possibility of death waiting in the valley ahead, Clara still believed changing things was possible. And some part of Ethan, the part he'd spent 6 years trying to bury, wanted desperately to believe her. "Get some sleep," Ethan said finally, turning away. "We ride early." Clara didn't respond, just settled back against the boulder with her injured arm cradled against her chest. Within minutes, her breathing evened into sleep. Ethan stayed awake, keeping watch, thinking about fathers and failures and the difference between running and surviving. Thinking about the valley waiting ahead with all its ghosts and broken promises. Thinking about whether Clara was right that some fights chose you, whether you were ready or not. The mountains came at them like a wall of broken stone and ice. 3 days of hard riding through country that got meaner with every mile, and Clara's shoulder still wasn't healing right. Ethan could see it in the way she held herself in the saddle, the lines of pain etched deeper around her eyes each morning. They'd avoided Continental's search parties twice more, once by hiding in a narrow gorge while riders passed within 50 yards, once by traveling through the night when most sensible people were camped. The lack of sleep was wearing on both of them, making everything feel slightly unreal, like they were moving through a fever dream where the destination kept receding. But on the fourth morning, Ethan recognized a distinctive rock formation shaped like a broken fist, and his stomach tightened. "We're close," he said. "Valley's just over that ridge." Clara straightened despite her exhaustion. "How close?" 2 hours, maybe less." Ethan studied the terrain, looking for the approaches he'd used as a kid. "There's a back way in through the timber, harder to spot from a distance." They rode in silence after that, the weight of arrival settling over them like physical pressure. Ethan's hands were sweating despite the cold. 6 years of staying away, of telling himself the valley was cursed land that had already taken everything it could from him. And now here he was, riding straight back into the graveyard. The trees closed around them as they climbed, pine and aspen that smelled like memory. Ethan had hunted these woods with his father, learned to track deer through the underbrush, helped cut timber for fence posts every autumn. The land remembered him even if he'd tried to forget it. "Stop," Clara's voice cut through his thoughts. Ethan pulled his horse up. "What?" Clara was staring at something ahead through the trees. Ethan followed her gaze and felt ice slide down his spine. Smoke. Just a thin column rising above the tree line, but unmistakable. "Someone's at the homestead," Clara said. "Could be squatters. Could be Continental's men waiting to see if we show up." Ethan dismounted and tied his horse. "We go on foot from here. Quiet." They moved through the timber like ghosts, leaving the horses hidden in a dense thicket. Clara struggled with the terrain. The injured shoulder threw off her balance, and every stumble brought fresh pain she tried to hide. But she kept moving, kept following, the satchel still secured across her good shoulder. The tree line ended at the top of a small rise, and below them the valley opened up like a wound. Ethan had prepared himself for this moment, but seeing it still hit like a fist. The homestead buildings were worse than he remembered. Sagging roofs, broken windows, fences collapsed into themselves. The barn his father had built when Ethan was 10 was nothing but charred timbers. Weeds had taken over what used to be the garden. Everything looked dead and forgotten, except for the smoke. It came from the main house chimney. Someone had a fire going inside. "I count 3 horses," Clara whispered, pointing at the corral. "All saddled. Continental's men." Ethan's jaw clenched. "They're waiting for us." They watched from the tree line for 20 minutes, studying the layout and looking for movement. Finally, a man emerged from the house carrying a rifle, not Scarface from Dry Creek, but cut from the same cloth. Hard eyes, casual cruelty in the way he moved. He pissed off the porch, spit into the dirt, and went back inside without bothering to look around. Arrogant. Confident they controlled the territory so completely that basic caution didn't matter. "We should leave," Ethan said. "Circle back? Come up with a different plan." "No." Claire's voice was steel. "I need samples from the spring. Need to document the water table. This is why we came. Getting killed won't help your father's research. Running won't finish it either." Claire started to move down the slope before Ethan caught her good arm. "Wait. Just wait." Ethan forced himself to think instead of react. "There's another way in. Old livestock trail on the west side leads down to the spring without passing the buildings. If we're lucky, they don't know about it. And if we're not lucky, we find out how fast you can run with a dislocated shoulder." They circled wide through the timber, staying well out of sight of the homestead. The livestock trail was exactly where Ethan remembered. Overgrown now, barely visible, but still passable. It switched back down the valley wall through dense brush that tore at their clothes and made stealth nearly impossible. Halfway down, Clara slipped on loose rock. Ethan caught her before she fell, but the movement wrenched her injured shoulder and she made a sound like something breaking. She doubled over, breathing hard through clenched teeth, face gone white. "I'm fine," she managed before Ethan could ask. "Keep moving." The spring emerged from the valley wall about 50 feet above the valley floor, a clear pool fed by underground sources that had never run dry in living memory. Ethan's father used to say the spring was the valley's heart, the reason the land could support crops and livestock when everywhere else turned to dust during drought years. Continental wanted that heart, wanted to control it, monopolize it, use it as leverage against every settler in the territory. Clara knelt beside the spring with her good hand and pulled glass vials from her satchel. Despite the pain and exhaustion, her movements became precise, methodical. She collected water samples, tested pH with paper strips that changed color, made notes in a leather journal using handwriting that shook but remained legible. "The mineral content matches my father's original survey," she said quietly, more to herself than Ethan. "Calcium, magnesium, trace elements. This water could support irrigation across 300 acres, maybe more." Ethan kept watch on the homestead below. From this angle, he could see the corral and part of the main house. No movement yet, but that wouldn't last. Clara worked for maybe 15 minutes, collecting samples and documenting everything with the intensity of someone who knew this might be their only chance. When she finally stood, her satchel was heavier with glass vials carefully wrapped in cloth. "I need to see the irrigation channels," Clara said. "The ones your father built. If they're still structurally sound, they're not. Continental's men probably destroyed them years ago. I still need to document it. Destruction of water infrastructure is another charge we can bring against them." "Clara, I didn't come this far to do half the job." Her eyes met his. 5 more minutes. That's all I need." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to grab her and drag her back up the slope before their luck ran out. But he understood that desperation, had felt it himself once, back when he still believed fighting mattered. 5 minutes, he said, "then we leave whether you're finished or not." They moved along the spring channel toward where the irrigation system began. Ethan's father had built it by hand over 3 summers, stone-lined ditches that carried water down to the fields, with wooden gates to control flow. It had been elegant in its simplicity, proof that intelligence could overcome the land's harshness. What remained was wreckage. Someone had systematically destroyed every gate, shattered every stone lining, filled sections with rocks and debris to block water flow. It wasn't just abandonment, it was deliberate vandalism meant to ensure the system could never be easily restored. Clara photographed everything with a small camera she pulled from her satchel. Click, advance the film. Click again. Building evidence one image at a time. They spent weeks doing this, she said, anger making her voice shake. This wasn't just killing your father and taking the land. This was making sure nobody could ever use it the way he intended, making sure his work died with him. Ethan stared at the broken channels and felt something crack inside his chest. All those summers helping his father move stones, dig trenches, test water flow. All those evenings sitting on the porch while Thomas Crow explained how the system would support not just their family, but neighbors. How sharing water was the foundation of community instead of competition. Continental hadn't just killed his father. They'd killed the dream that cooperation could win against greed. Time's up, Ethan said, his voice rougher than intended. We need to go. But before Clara could respond, shouting erupted from the homestead below. They'd been spotted. 3 men poured out of the house, rifles in hand, already running toward the spring. One of them fired a shot that cracked past Ethan's head, close enough to feel the air move. Run! Ethan shoved Clara toward the slope. Go, go, go! They scrambled up the livestock trail with bullets kicking up dirt around them. Clara's injured shoulder made climbing agony. Ethan could hear her gasping with each pull upward, but fear kept her moving. Behind them, the men shouted coordination, spreading out to cut off escape routes. Ethan fired twice without aiming, just trying to make them take cover long enough to buy seconds. His revolver only had 2 rounds left after that. Not enough for 3 men. They crashed through the brush at the top of the slope and ran for the horses. Behind them, the pursuit was closing. Ethan could hear boots on stone, heavy breathing, the sound of men who did this for a living and knew exactly how to run down fleeing prey. Clara reached her horse first, but couldn't mount one-handed. Ethan literally threw her into the saddle, probably hurting her shoulder worse, but there was no time for gentleness. He swung onto his own horse as the first pursuer emerged from the brush 30 yards back. The man raised his rifle. Ethan fired first. The shot went wide, but close enough to make the man dive for cover. Then they were riding hard through the timber with gunshots cracking behind them and no clear idea where they were going except away. A branch caught Clara across the face, nearly knocking her from the saddle. Ethan grabbed her coat and hauled her upright without slowing down. The horses were panicking, running blind through terrain that could break their legs with one wrong step. Behind them, the pursuit gained ground. Continental's men knew these woods, knew how to ride them fast. Ethan's only advantage was desperation and the willingness to take risks that might kill them slightly slower than bullets. They burst out of the timber into open ground, and Ethan made a split-second decision, turn north instead of east, heading deeper into the mountains instead of back toward civilization. The men behind them hesitated, probably thinking Ethan was making a mistake because north led to high country where settlements were sparse and winter came early. But Ethan wasn't looking for settlements. He was looking for a specific place his father had shown him once, years ago. A place where the land got mean enough that pursuing someone wasn't worth the risk. They rode for 2 more hours, pushing the horses past safe limits. Clara was barely conscious in her saddle, clinging to the horn with her good hand while her body sagged with exhaustion. Blood ran from the cut on her face where the branch had hit, mixing with the older blood from Dry Creek. Finally, when the horses were ready to collapse, Ethan spotted what he'd been searching for. A narrow canyon cutting into the mountain face, barely wide enough for a horse. The entrance was hidden behind a rock fall that looked impassable unless you knew the angle. Ethan's father had used it once to escape a grizzly, and the story had stayed with Ethan through all the years away. He guided Clara's horse into the canyon first, then followed. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, so narrow in places they had to turn the horses sideways to squeeze through. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded. Either they'd lost Continental's men or the riders had decided following into this death trap wasn't worth the payoff. The canyon opened after 100 yards into a small box valley maybe a quarter-mile across. Grass grew thick despite the altitude, fed by a spring that trickled from the rock face. It was the kind of hidden pocket the frontier sometimes offered, places where geography created shelter against the harshness. Ethan helped Clara down from her horse, and she immediately collapsed. Not unconscious, but done. Her body had nothing left to give. "We're safe for now," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "This place is hard to find. They'd have to know it existed to follow us in." Clara nodded without speaking, too exhausted for words. Ethan built a small fire using dead wood scattered around the valley, then used water from the spring to clean the cut on Clara's face. The wound wasn't deep, but it would scar. One more mark Continental had left on her. While Clara slept, Ethan tended the horses and thought about the destroyed irrigation channels, about his father's dream turned to rubble, about the casual cruelty of men who would spend weeks destroying something just to prove it could never be rebuilt. His hands were shaking. Whether from exhaustion or rage, Ethan couldn't tell. When Clara finally woke, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. She sat up slowly, testing her injuries, and found Ethan sitting by the fire, staring at nothing. "We got the samples," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "We documented the destruction. It's not everything I needed, but it's enough to start building the case." Ethan didn't respond. "Are you okay?" Clara asked. "No." The word came out harsher than intended. "Seeing that place again, seeing what they did to it, I'm not okay." Clara moved to sit beside him, moving carefully around her injuries. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pushed to go there. You did what you had to do, same as me 6 years ago when I ran." Ethan finally looked at her. "Difference is, you're trying to fix what broke. I just ran from it. Running kept you alive." "Did it?" Ethan gestured at the valley around them, at the situation they'd fled into. "I ran for 6 years and ended up right back where I started. Only now there's someone else's blood on my hands too. Your shoulder, your face. That's because I helped you." "That's because Continental is evil," Clara corrected. "Not because you helped me. You didn't cause this." "I didn't stop it either. Not 6 years ago. Not now." Ethan's fists clenched. "My father died on that porch and I hid behind a water barrel. Hid and survived and ran. And they're still winning, still destroying people's lives, still getting away with it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My father told me something right before he died. He said the hardest part of fighting wasn't the fear of losing. It was accepting that you might sacrifice everything and still fail, that the fight itself was the only thing you could control, not the outcome." "That's just another way of saying we're going to lose." "No, it's saying we define victory differently." Clara pulled her satchel close and carefully removed one of the water samples. The glass caught the firelight, making the liquid inside shimmer. "This vial proves your father was right about the water, proves Continental lied when they claimed the valley couldn't sustain independent settlement. That's not nothing. It's not justice either." "Justice is 1,000 small victories that eventually add up to change." Clara set the vial down carefully. "Your father's irrigation system was one victory. My father's research was another. These samples are another. Each one matters, even if none of them alone changes everything." Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to think that collecting water samples and documenting destruction could somehow balance the scale against corporate violence and institutional corruption. But sitting here in a hidden valley running from men with guns, it felt like bringing a knife to a shooting war. "What happens when we leave here?" Ethan asked. "Where do we go?" "There's a territorial courthouse in Casper. That's where I file the evidence." Claire's jaw set. "And then I testify publicly about everything Continental has done. Make it loud enough that even bribed newspapers can't ignore it. They'll kill you before you reach the courthouse." "Probably they'll try." Clara met his eyes. "Will you help me get there anyway?" The question hung between them in the firelight. Ethan could say no, could help Clara get somewhere safe and then disappear again into the territories where Continental's reach was weaker, could go back to the life he'd built on running and forgetting. But he thought about the destroyed irrigation channels, about his father bleeding out while Ethan hid, about 6 years of telling himself that survival justified cowardice. "Yeah," Ethan said finally, "I'll help you get there." Clara nodded like she'd expected nothing else. "Then we should plan our route. Casper's 100 miles southeast. We'll need to avoid towns where Continental has strong presence, which means..." A gunshot cracked across the valley. They both dove for cover as a second shot kicked up dirt near the fire. Ethan's hand found his revolver, 2 rounds left. and he searched desperately for the shooter's position. "How did they find us?" Clara hissed. "Doesn't matter." Ethan spotted movement on the canyon rim. "They're above us. We're trapped." More shots. One caught their water canteen and split it open, precious water pouring into the dirt. Another punched through Ethan's saddle. The horses screamed and bolted toward the canyon entrance. A voice echoed down from the rim. "Clara Whitmore, we know you're down there." Ethan recognized the voice. Scarface from Dry Creek. "Your father's research belongs to Continental Cattle," Scarface shouted. "Hand over the maps and we'll let you walk out of here. Keep them and we'll kill you both and take them off your corpse." Clara clutched her satchel tighter. "Don't answer him." "We're pinned down," Ethan said. "Can't fight, can't run. In another minute they'll start moving down the canyon walls. Then we negotiate. With men who've already tried to kill you twice? With men who want these maps badly enough to chase us this far." Clara's eyes were calculating despite the fear. That means the research scares them, means they know it could hurt them if it reaches the right people. Another shot. This one close enough that rock fragments stung Ethan's face. "Last chance," Scarface called. "Papers for your life." Clara made a decision. She stood up, hands raised, the satchel hanging from her good shoulder. "Don't shoot," her voice carried across the valley. "I want to talk terms." "No terms." Scarface's silhouette appeared on the canyon rim, backlit by the setting sun. "Papers or death." "You can't read them without me," Clara shouted back. "My father used a specific notation system. The maps are useless to anyone who doesn't understand his methodology. Kill me, and you destroy the only thing you came for." Silence from above. Scarface was probably deciding if she was bluffing. Ethan kept his revolver ready, knowing 2 bullets wouldn't save them, but needing to hold something solid anyway. "You're lying," Scarface finally shouted. "Test me." Clara pulled out one of the maps, carefully, making sure they could see she wasn't drawing a weapon. These elevation markers, the water table measurements, the mineral content annotations, they're all coded. My father spent 20 years developing this system specifically so Continental couldn't steal his work and use it themselves. Without me, these are just expensive paper. More silence. Longer this time. Then Scarface said something Ethan didn't expect. "Come up here, alone. Leave the man and bring the papers. We'll discuss terms." "No," Ethan said immediately. "That's suicide. It's the only option that keeps us both breathing for the next 5 minutes." Clara looked at him with eyes that had already made peace with what came next. "If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it already. They need the research intact. That's leverage. Leverage only works if you're alive to use it. Then I'll have to stay alive." Clara handed Ethan her satchel. "If I'm not back in an hour, ride for Casper. Get these samples to the territorial courthouse. Tell them everything." "Clara, please." Her hand found his, squeezed once. "Finish this if I can't." Then she started walking toward the canyon wall before Ethan could stop her. He watched her climb, using hand and footholds in the rock despite her injured shoulder. Watched her disappear over the rim where men with guns waited. The longest 60 seconds of Ethan's life passed before he heard voices. Not shouting, talking, negotiating. The conversation went on for 20 minutes. Ethan couldn't make out words, just tones. Clara's voice stayed level. Scarface's got louder several times before dropping again. At one point, someone else spoke, another man's voice, probably one of the other riders. Then silence. Ethan counted seconds, minutes, each one stretching impossibly long. His revolver was slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed to climb up there, to intervene, to do something other than wait helplessly while Clara faced men who'd already proven they'd kill for those maps. When Clara finally appeared on the canyon rim again, the sunset behind her made it impossible to read her expression. She started climbing down, slower this time, favoring her injuries. Ethan met her at the bottom. "What happened?" "I made a deal." Clara's voice was steady, but her hand shook as she took back her satchel. "They're letting us go." "What? Why?" "Because I convinced them that killing us creates problems they don't need." Clara sat down heavily by the dead fire. "I told them we'd leave Wyoming, that I'd take my father's research east and never come back. The Continental could keep the valley and every other piece of stolen land if they just let us walk away alive." Ethan stared at her. "You're lying to them." "Of course I'm lying." Clara's smile was bitter. But they believed me because I sold it like I meant it. Cried real tears, begged for mercy, promised everything they wanted to hear. And somewhere in all that performance, Scarface decided letting us go was easier than explaining to his bosses why he spent 3 weeks chasing 2 people across Wyoming and came back with nothing. They'll figure out you lied eventually. Eventually, Clara met his eyes. But by then we'll be in Casper with this evidence filed in territorial court. By then it won't matter what they figure out because the truth will already be public. Ethan wanted to believe it could work that simply, that Continental would just let them ride away based on Clara's tearful promises. But he'd seen too much of how the frontier worked to trust mercy from men who'd already demonstrated cruelty. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Now, before they change their minds." Clara stood, testing her balance. "They're giving us 1 hour head start. After that, all promises are void." They found the horses grazing near the canyon entrance, still spooked but intact. Mounting was agony for Clara. Her shoulder had stiffened during the negotiation, and every movement brought fresh pain. But she gritted through it without complaint. As they rode out of the canyon, Ethan looked back once, saw silhouettes on the rim watching them leave. "Don't look back," Clara said quietly. "Just ride." They rode southeast through darkness, putting miles between themselves and the valley. Behind them, the mountains faded into shadows. Ahead, somewhere in the distance, Casper waited with its courthouse and territorial judges and the possibility that truth might actually matter. Ethan didn't believe it. But riding beside Clara with her father's research secured against her chest and determination burning brighter than fear, he wanted desperately to be wrong. The 1 hour head start lasted exactly 43 minutes before they heard riders behind them. Ethan knew immediately what had happened. Scarface had never intended to let them go. The negotiation was just theater, a way to get Clara off the canyon rim without a fight, a way to avoid the mess of shooting them in a confined space where ricochets could destroy the very maps Continental wanted. Now they were in open country, where bullets traveled clean and bodies could disappear into ravines. "They're coming," Ethan said, not bothering to look back. "How's your shoulder?" "Doesn't matter." Clara's face was set, pale but determined. "How many rounds do you have left?" 2. "That's not enough." "I know." They pushed the horses harder, but the animals were already exhausted from days of running. Behind them, the pursuit sounded fresh, organized, closing the distance with the methodical patience of hunters who knew their prey was faltering. The land offered no shelter here, just rolling plains broken by the occasional dry creek bed. No timber to hide in, no canyons to lose themselves in, nothing but grass and distance and the gradually brightening eastern horizon that would make them even easier to spot. "There," Clara pointed ahead where the terrain dipped sharply. "Is that the Powder River?" Ethan's stomach dropped. The Powder River during spring runoff was a churning nightmare of brown water and hidden currents that drowned people regularly. Crossing it was dangerous even with fresh horses and daylight. In the pre-dawn darkness, on exhausted mounts with armed men closing in behind them, it was suicide. "We're not crossing that," Ethan said. "We don't have a choice." Clara, "They're going to catch us in the next 10 minutes. We can die here or take our chances with the river." Clara's voice stayed level despite the fear underneath. "At least the river doesn't shoot back." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to find a third option that didn't involve drowning or bullets. But the sound of hoofbeats behind them was getting louder, and Clara was right. They were out of options that didn't end bloody. They reached the river as the first shot cracked across the plains. The bullet went wide, but close enough to prove Continental's men were in range. The Powder River churned below them, maybe 60 feet wide, moving fast enough that Ethan could see debris spinning in the current. "Stay upstream of me," Ethan said, already guiding his horse toward the water. "If you go under, grab anything floating. Don't fight the current, just try to angle toward the far bank." "Ethan, no time, go." Clara drove her horse into the river, and the animal immediately panicked. The current caught them both, pulling them downstream faster than Ethan expected. Clara held on with her good hand, her injured arm useless, while the horse fought to keep its head above water. Ethan followed, felt the cold slam into him like a fist, felt his horse lose its footing as the riverbed dropped away into deeper water. Behind them, more gunshots. One bullet hit the water near Clara's head, and she ducked instinctively. A mistake that nearly pulled her from the saddle. The current was vicious. It spun them downstream, slamming them into submerged rocks and debris that Ethan couldn't see until impact. His horse's eyes were white with terror, hooves churning water desperately. Ahead, Clara was losing her grip, sliding sideways in the saddle while the river tried to tear her away. Ethan drove his horse closer, fighting the current, until he could reach out and grab Clara's coat. "Hold on!" "I can't." Water filled Clara's mouth, cutting off words. Her good hand slipped on the wet leather of her reins. The satchel, secured across her shoulder, was filling with water and dragging her down. "Let go of the bag," Ethan shouted. "No!" A submerged log appeared out of nowhere. Clara's horse hit it broadside, screamed, and went under. Clara disappeared into the brown water, still clutching the satchel, and Ethan's heart stopped. He let go of his own reins, dove sideways off his horse into the churning water. The current immediately grabbed him, pulled him under, filled his mouth and nose with silt and cold. He couldn't see anything, couldn't tell which way was up, couldn't find Clara in the chaos. His hand found fabric. He grabbed, pulled, felt Clara's coat in his fist, pulled harder, dragging her toward the surface until they both broke into air, gasping and choking. "The bank!" Ethan managed between mouthfuls of water. "Swim for the bank!" They weren't swimming so much as being carried by the current while desperately trying to angle toward the far shore. Clara had lost her horse, but still had the satchel, the waterproof leather keeping it afloat even as it tried to drag her under. Ethan kept one hand fisted in her coat while using the other to claw toward the bank. His boots hit bottom. Shallow water, rocks underfoot, the current still strong but no longer drowning. He hauled Clara upright and they staggered toward the shore, falling twice before finally collapsing on muddy ground 20 yards downstream from where they'd entered the water. Behind them, across the river, Continental's men sat on their horses watching. Scarface was there, close enough that Ethan could see the expression on his face, calculation mixed with fury. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Scarface raised his rifle. "Run!" Ethan grabbed Clara and pulled her toward a stand of cottonwoods as bullets started kicking up mud around them. They ran through the trees, soaked and exhausted, while gunfire cracked behind them. Ethan's horse had made it across and stood trembling near the tree line. Clara's was gone, either drowned or swept so far downstream they'd never find it. "Up!" Ethan gasped, pushing Clara toward his horse. "We're riding double." Clara tried to climb into the saddle, and her injured shoulder finally gave out completely. She screamed and fell, hitting the ground hard. Ethan literally lifted her and threw her onto the horse, then swung up behind her and drove the animal into a gallop before she could protest. One horse carrying two people wouldn't outrun pursuit for long, but Ethan wasn't thinking long term. He was thinking about the next 5 minutes, the next mile, the next breath. The cottonwoods gave way to open plains again. Behind them, Ethan could hear Continental's men reaching the river, arguing about whether to cross. Apparently even hired guns had limits to their willingness to risk drowning for a paycheck. But the argument didn't last long. Within minutes, Ethan heard splashing as horses entered the water. They were coming. "How far to Casper?" Clara asked. She was slumped against Ethan's chest, barely conscious, the cold and pain finally overwhelming her. 2 days. Maybe 3. Ethan looked down at the horse already laboring under double weight. "We're not going to make it like this." "Then we find help." "There's nothing out here, no settlements, no homesteads, nothing for 30 miles. "There has to be something." Clara's voice was fading. "Anything." Ethan scanned the horizon desperately and saw nothing but grass and sky. They were in the emptiest part of Wyoming, the places where people avoided settling because the land offered nothing worth dying for. Behind them, Continental's men would be across the river soon, and then it was just a matter of running down a foundering horse carrying double. They rode for another hour as the sun climbed and Clara's breathing became more labored. Her shoulder was worse. Ethan could see the swelling even through her wet clothes. The river crossing had probably torn something that needed actual medical attention instead of crude field treatment. When the horse finally started to falter, legs trembling with exhaustion, Ethan knew they were finished. Then he saw smoke on the eastern horizon. Not much, just a thin column rising against the morning sky. Could be a campfire, could be a homestead, could be nothing useful. But it was something, and something was better than dying of exposure in open country. "Hold on," Ethan said, turning the horse toward the smoke. What they found was a camp, but not the kind Ethan expected. 8 wagons arranged in a loose circle, maybe 20 people moving between them. Not travelers passing through, settlers. The kind who'd given up on towns and decided to carve out survival in the places nobody else wanted. As Ethan rode closer, men appeared with rifles, defensive but not hostile, watching to see if this was trouble or just desperation. Ethan raised his hands carefully. "We need help. My companion's injured. We're not looking for trouble." An older man stepped forward, weathered face studying them with eyes that had seen enough to recognize truth from lies. "You're running from something." "Continental Cattle Company." Ethan saw no point in lying. "They've been chasing us for a week." The atmosphere in the camp shifted immediately, not toward hostility, toward understanding. These were people who knew exactly what Continental Cattle meant. "Get down," the older man said, "carefully. Let's see how bad she's hurt." Ethan dismounted and helped Clara down. She could barely stand, leaning heavily against him while the world spun around her. Two women appeared from one of the wagons, took one look at Clara's condition, and took charge with the efficient competence of frontier women who had dealt with injuries before. "Dislocated shoulder, infection setting in," one of them announced after a quick examination. "Head wounds infected too. She needs proper treatment or she'll lose the arm." "Can you help her?" Ethan asked. "We can try." The woman looked at him squarely. "But if Continental's chasing you, helping makes us targets too. Why should we risk that?" Ethan started to answer, but Clara found her voice first. "Because we have evidence." She pulled the waterproof satchel from her shoulder with her good hand. "Evidence that Continental has been stealing water rights through fraud and violence across Wyoming. Evidence that could break their monopoly and give independent settlers a real chance." The older man took the satchel, opened it carefully, and examined the maps and water samples inside. His expression changed as he read Clara's father's research notes. "This is real," he said quietly. "The water table data, the irrigation surveys, this is real documentation." "My father spent 10 years compiling it." Clara swayed on her feet. "Continental killed him to keep it buried. They'll kill us too if they catch us. But if we can get it to the territorial courthouse in Casper—" "Continental owns the judges in Casper," the older man interrupted. "Filing evidence there won't accomplish anything except getting you arrested on false charges." The words hit like cold water. Ethan had known the courts were compromised, but hearing it stated so flatly destroyed the last fragment of hope that legal channels might work. "Then what do we do?" Clara asked. "We can't fight them with guns. We don't have their money or their resources. The research was supposed to be enough." "The research is enough." The older man handed back the satchel. "But not for courts. For people. If this information reaches the settler communities across Wyoming, if people see proof that Continental's been lying about water rights, then you've got a different kind of fight." "An armed rebellion," Ethan said flatly. "That ends with massacres. That ends with Continental having to choose between giving up some power or losing all of it." The older man's eyes were hard. "Right now they control everything because settlers are divided and desperate. But if we organize, if we share resources and support each other based on this research, then we become too big to simply shoot." One of the women spoke up. "There's a gathering happening in 3 weeks. Settlers from across the territory meeting at Horseshoe Station to discuss forming a cooperative. If you could present this evidence there, Continental will attack the gathering," Ethan interrupted. "They won't let that many independent settlers organize in one place." "Probably," the older man smiled grimly. "Which is why we've been preparing for that possibility. 300 settlers, many of them armed. Continental's hired guns are good, but they're not stupid. Attacking a fortified gathering is different than burning isolated homesteads." Clara was barely standing now, held upright only by stubbornness and Ethan's support. But her eyes were calculating despite the pain and fever. "If we present the research at the gathering," she said slowly, "and if Continental attacks anyway, then we'll have witnesses. Proof not just of fraud, but of violence against organized settlers. That's a story even Eastern newspapers can't ignore." "It's also a story that gets you killed," Ethan said, "along with everyone else at that gathering." "So we don't go." Clara looked at him. "We keep running, keep hiding, and Continental keeps winning. That what you want?" Ethan wanted to say yes. Wanted to grab Clara and ride for Montana or Canada or anywhere Continental's reach couldn't follow. Wanted to survive instead of sacrifice themselves for a fight that would probably fail anyway. But he thought about the destroyed irrigation channels in the valley, about his father bleeding out while hired guns laughed, About 6 years of running that had accomplished nothing except keeping him alive to feel ashamed. 3 weeks, Ethan said. That enough time to heal her shoulder? The woman examined Clara again. If the infection doesn't get worse, if she rests, big ifs, then we rest here. Ethan made the decision before he could reconsider. Help her heal. And then we go to Horseshoe Station and burn Continental's empire down. The older man nodded slowly. You'll be welcome. But you should know, once you commit to this, there's no walking away. Continental will make sure everyone at that gathering is marked. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Already doing that anyway, Ethan said. They gave Clara one of the wagons to recover in, and for 3 days she drifted in and out of consciousness while fever ravaged her body. The infection in her shoulder was worse than anyone realized. The river water had introduced bacteria that spread fast and vicious. The camp's women treated it with poultices and whiskey, and prayers that accomplished varying degrees of nothing. On the 4th day, Clara's fever finally broke. Ethan was sitting beside her when she opened her eyes, the first clear awareness in days. She looked around the wagon, trying to orient herself. Where are we? Her voice was rough. Settler camp, about 40 miles from Horseshoe Station. Ethan helped her sit up slowly. Your shoulder's healing, slowly. How's the pain? Manageable. Clara tested her range of motion and winced. How long was I out? 4 days. We don't have 4 days to spare. The gathering is in 19 days, plenty of time. Ethan handed her water. Drink, you're dehydrated. Clara drank, then noticed something in Ethan's expression. What happened while I was unconscious? Continental's men rode through here 2 days ago, looking for us. Clara's hand found her satchel immediately. The research is safe. We hid it. Hid you too. Told them we hadn't seen anyone matching your description. Ethan's jaw clenched. They didn't believe us. Tore through the camp looking, destroyed 2 wagons, threatened to burn the rest unless we turned you over. What stopped them? 30 rifles pointed at their heads. Ethan's smile was bitter. Turns out these settlers have been preparing for Continental's violence for a while. When it came down to it, the hired guns decided killing us all wasn't worth the payoff. So they left. They left, but not before promising they'd be back with more men. Ethan looked at her seriously. These people are risking everything by sheltering us. If Continental comes back in force, they'll massacre everyone here. Clara's face hardened. Then we need to leave. Tonight. Lead Continental away from the camp. You can barely sit up, let alone ride. I'll manage. You'll die. And then your father's research dies with you. Ethan shook his head. We stay until you're strong enough to fight. These people understand the risk. They chose it anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara healed slowly while the settler camp prepared for war. Men cleaned rifles and stockpiled ammunition. Women organized supply chains and evacuation plans for children. Everyone trained, everyone planned, everyone understood that the gathering at Horseshoe Station would likely end in violence. Clara spent her recovery teaching the settlers how to read her father's research, showing them the water surveys, explaining the irrigation principles, proving that Continental's monopoly on water rights was built on lies and fraud. The information spread through the camp like fire, and with it came something Ethan hadn't seen in years. Hope. Not naive hope, not of the kind that thought everything would work out because justice prevailed, but the harder kind, the hope that came from seeing a path forward even if walking it meant bleeding. On the 15th day, riders appeared on the horizon, not Continental's men this time, other settlers, families fleeing burned homesteads, survivors of Continental's violence, people who'd heard rumors about the gathering and come desperate for something to believe in. They brought stories that made Ethan's blood cold. Continental was escalating. Whole settlements burned. Families driven off land their grandparents had settled. One young rancher beaten nearly to death for refusing to sell his water rights. Another family's well poisoned with lye, making the land worthless and driving them into bankruptcy. They're trying to break us before the gathering, the older man said, studying the new arrivals. Trying to spread enough fear that people won't show up at Horseshoe Station. Is it working? Ethan asked. Look around. The older man gestured at the growing camp. Does it look like it's working? It didn't. For every family that fled Wyoming entirely, 2 more arrived at the camp ready to fight. The violence that was supposed to scatter them was instead forging them into something Continental hadn't anticipated. a unified resistance. Clara watched it happen with fierce satisfaction. My father always said Continental's biggest weakness was their assumption that fear alone could control people. He said eventually, fear turns into rage, and rage finds targets. Your father was smart, Ethan said. He was right. Clara tested her shoulder, grimacing at the remaining stiffness. And Continental's about to learn exactly how right. 3 days before the gathering, Continental made their move. It was late afternoon when scouts spotted dust on the western horizon. Too much dust for a small group, at least 30 riders, maybe more, moving fast toward the camp. Everyone to defensive positions, the older man shouted. The camp had prepared for this. Wagons formed a tight perimeter. Men took cover behind them with rifles ready. Women and children retreated to the center where they'd be protected. It was crude fortification, but better than nothing. Ethan checked his revolver, 3 rounds acquired from the camp's limited supplies, and took position beside Clara at one of the wagon gaps. You should be with the others, Ethan said, in the center where it's safer. I didn't come this far to hide during the fight. Clara held a rifle awkwardly with her still healing shoulder. Besides, I can shoot left-handed. Can you hit anything left-handed? I guess we're about to find out. The riders stopped just outside rifle range and sat there, letting the settlers see their numbers. Ethan counted 34 men, all armed, all wearing the casual confidence of people who'd done this before and expected it to go the same way. Scarface rode forward alone, stopping 50 yards from the wagon circle. Clara Whitmore, his voice carried across the distance. This doesn't have to end bloody. Hand over the research and we'll ride away. Everyone lives. Clara stepped into the gap between wagons where Scarface could see her. The research goes to Horseshoe Station. You want it? You'll have to kill every person here. Don't think we won't. Scarface's horse stamped nervously. You're protecting a woman who's got you all fooled. Her father's research is lies. Continental has legal claim to every water right in Wyoming. Then why are you so desperate to destroy the evidence? Clara shouted back. If the research is lies, let it be examined in court. Let territorial surveyors verify the data. There won't be any court. Scarface's mask of civility cracked. There won't be any gathering. There'll just be ashes and bodies unless you hand over those maps. Come take them. Clara raised her rifle. If you think it's worth dying for. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Scarface turned his horse and rode back to his men. They huddled briefly, and Ethan knew exactly what they were discussing, whether killing 30 armed settlers was worth the payoff. Apparently, Continental had made that decision for them. The riders spread out in a line and started forward at a walk. Not charging, not shooting yet, just advancing with the patient menace of people who knew numbers and experience were on their side. Hold fire, the older man commanded. Let them get close. Make every shot count. The riders came closer, 40 yards, 30, 20. Fire! The wagon circle erupted. 30 rifles firing simultaneously, smoke filling the air, the sound like thunder concentrated into seconds. Continental's riders scattered, several men falling from horses, others returning fire while wheeling away. Bullets punched through wagon canvas and buried themselves in wood. One of the settlers screamed and went down clutching his leg. Another took a round through the shoulder but kept firing. Ethan aimed carefully, squeezed the trigger, saw one of Continental's men jerk and fall. 2 rounds left. Beside him, Clara fired and missed, the rifle's kick wrenching her injured shoulder. She gasped but kept the weapon up, searching for another target. The riders pulled back out of range, regrouping. 3 of their men were down, wounded or dead. The settlers had lost 1 killed and 2 wounded. Not a favorable exchange for Continental considering their objective was to overwhelm through force. They'll try again, the older man shouted. Reload! Get the wounded to cover. They had maybe 2 minutes before the next assault. Ethan helped Clara reload while keeping watch on Continental's riders. They were arguing amongst themselves now, probably some of them deciding the payoff wasn't worth facing organized resistance. But Scarface was shouting them down, pointing toward the camp, gesturing violently. The argument ended when Scarface drew his pistol and shot one of the arguing men in the chest. The message was clear: attack or die. The riders formed up again, tighter this time, and charged at full gallop. Ethan grabbed Clara and pulled her down behind the wagon as bullets tore through the air above them. The riders were firing while riding, not accurate, but volume compensating for precision. Wood splintered, someone screamed, glass shattered. The settlers returned fire. Disciplined volleys timed to maximize impact. More riders fell. Horses screamed and bolted, but Continental's men kept coming, and some made it to the wagon line. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted as riders forced through gaps between wagons. Ethan shot one man who appeared over the wagon edge, his final round. Then it was just fists and desperation. A rider grabbed Clara, trying to drag her from cover. She struck him across the face with her rifle stock, and when he released her, Ethan tackled him into the dirt. They rolled, punching, until Ethan got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed until the struggling stopped. Somewhere to the left, fire bloomed. One of the wagons was burning. "Fall back," the older man shouted. "Tighten the circle." The settlers retreated inward, abandoning the outer wagons to flames while consolidating around the center. Continental's men pressed the advantage, pouring fire into the shrinking defensive perimeter. They were losing. Not quickly, but inevitably. Continental had more men, more ammunition, and nothing to lose by burning everything. Then, from the east, gunfire erupted. New riders appeared, at least 20 of them, charging into Continental's flank. Not hired guns. Settlers. More families who'd been traveling to the gathering, arriving early, seeing the fight, and choosing to intervene. Continental's attack collapsed into chaos. Caught between two forces, outnumbered suddenly, Scarface's men broke and ran. Some tried to rally, but the momentum was gone. Within minutes, the survivors were fleeing west, while the combined settler groups fired at their backs. When the shooting finally stopped, the camp was in ruins. 2 wagons destroyed, 1 still burning. 5 settlers dead, a dozen wounded. Continental's casualties were higher, at least 10 dead that Ethan could see, maybe more scattered across the plains. But they'd survived. The camp had held. Clara sat in the dirt, rifle across her knees, face blackened with powder smoke and streaked with tears. "Is it over?" "For now." Ethan helped her stand. "They'll regroup. Come back stronger. Then we go to Horseshoe Station before they can." Clara picked up her satchel, checked that the research had survived the fight. 3 days until the gathering. We need to be there." The older man approached, bleeding from a cut on his forehead but standing tall. "You saved us. Your research, your willingness to fight. You gave people something worth bleeding for. That matters." "People died," Clara said quietly. "People were already dying. At least now they're dying for something that might change things." The older man looked toward Horseshoe Station. "We'll ride together, all of us. Let Continental try to stop 300 settlers moving as one force." Over the next 3 days, the camp transformed into a column. Families packed what survived, armed themselves with whatever weapons they owned, and prepared to march toward Horseshoe Station, knowing violence waited there. Clara rode beside Ethan at the front, her shoulders still weak but her spine straight. The satchel stayed secured across her chest, and she'd stopped flinching when gunshots echoed across the plains during target practice. "You ready for this?" Ethan asked as Horseshoe Station appeared on the horizon. Clara considered the question seriously. "No, but I'm going anyway. You?" "Same." They'd both changed during these weeks. Ethan had stopped running, stopped hiding behind survival as justification for cowardice. Clara had stopped believing that righteous anger alone could win fights. They'd both learned that changing things required more than courage or evidence. It required people willing to bleed beside you. Horseshoe Station was packed when they arrived. Hundreds of settlers from across Wyoming, all carrying the same exhausted determination. All ready to hear Clara's testimony, all ready to fight for the future her father's research promised. Continental's men were there too, watching from the edges. Not attacking yet, but the threat hung heavy as storm clouds. Clara stood before the gathering, maps spread across a makeshift table, and spoke truth that had cost too many lives to keep buried. And somewhere in the crowd, Ethan understood that whatever came next would be written in blood and hope mixed together until you couldn't tell them apart. Clara's voice carried across the gathering with the kind of certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. She stood on a makeshift platform built from wagon boards, her injured arm still in a sling, pointing at the map spread before 300 settlers who'd risked everything to be here. This line represents the natural water table. Her finger traced across her father's survey. Continental claimed this entire region was too arid for independent farming. They said settlers needed to buy water rights from them at inflated prices or abandon their homesteads. They lied. A murmur ran through the crowd. These were people who'd watched their crops fail, who'd sold livestock at bankruptcy prices, who'd buried children when wells ran dry during drought years. They knew what water scarcity meant in ways Eastern lawyers never would. My father documented 17 major underground spring systems across Wyoming that Continental knew about and deliberately concealed. Clara's voice hardened. They didn't just steal land. They stole the knowledge that would have let you survive without them. They built their empire on making you desperate. An older woman near the front spoke up. How do we know your father's research is accurate? How do we know you're not just another Easterner trying to sell us dreams? Fair question. Clara had expected it. Because I brought proof. She held up one of the glass vials from the valley spring. Water samples from locations Continental claimed were barren. Mineral analysis that proves these sources can support irrigation. Survey data that can be independently verified by any competent geologist. She paused, meeting eyes across the crowd. But more than that, because people have already died trying to keep this information buried. My father, Ethan's father, every settler Continental has murdered to maintain their monopoly. That's how you know it's real. The crowd was silent now, absorbing the implications. Ethan watched from the side of the platform, one hand resting on his empty revolver, scanning the edges of the gathering where Continental's men waited like wolves circling firelight. There were maybe 20 of them that Ethan could see. Not enough to attack 300 armed settlers openly, but enough to cause problems if they got creative. Scarface stood among them, face twisted with barely contained rage. A young rancher pushed forward. So what do we do? File complaints with territorial judges who take Continental's bribes? Write letters to newspapers that print whatever the corporation pays them to? No. Clara's smile was sharp. We build our own system. Use this research to find water on your own land. Share information between homesteads. Create irrigation cooperatives that don't need Continental's permission or resources. We make them irrelevant. They'll burn us out, someone shouted. They've done it before, they'll do it again. Probably. Clara didn't flinch from the truth. But there's a difference between burning 10 isolated homesteads and attacking an organized network of 300 families. There's a difference between violence nobody witnesses and violence that gets documented and sent to every newspaper east of the Mississippi. You're talking about a war, the young rancher said. I'm talking about survival. Clara's voice cut through the murmuring. Continental already chose war when they decided corporate profit mattered more than human lives. We're just choosing to fight back. The debate went on for hours. Some settlers argued for legal challenges despite the corrupted courts. Others wanted immediate armed resistance. A few advocated running, abandoning Wyoming entirely for territories Continental didn't control yet. But gradually, something emerged from the chaos. Not unanimous agreement, these were frontier people who'd sooner die than submit to someone else's vision, but a shared understanding that isolation meant death and organization meant possibility. As the sun began setting, the older man from the settler camp stepped onto the platform beside Clara. We're forming the Wyoming Water Cooperative, he announced. Any family willing to share Clara's research and support each other's water rights can join. We'll defend each other's homesteads, share irrigation knowledge, and document every act of violence Continental commits against us. We'll make them choose between giving up some control or losing all of it through public exposure. The crowd erupted. Not quite celebration. Too many of them had buried family for that, but something harder and more durable. Commitment forged through shared suffering. That's when Continental attacked. The first gunshot came from the northwest, dropping one of the settlers standing near the platform. Before anyone could react, gunfire erupted from 3 sides simultaneously. Not the 20 men Ethan had counted. More. At least 50 riders pouring out of the darkness, firing into the crowd, targeting the platform where Clara stood. Chaos exploded. Settlers dove for cover, returned fire, screamed for children. The platform splintered under concentrated gunfire, and Ethan tackled Clara off it seconds before the entire structure collapsed. Stay down! Ethan covered Clara's body with his own as bullets tore through the air above them. But Clara was already moving, crawling toward her satchel where it had fallen during the collapse. The research. Forget it. We need to get you out of here. Without the research, this was all for nothing. Continental's riders charged into the gathering, firing at anyone who moved. But the settlers were frontier people who'd learned to shoot before they learned to read. They formed defensive positions, laid down coordinated fire, turned the gathering into a killing ground. Ethan saw Scarface directing the attack, pointing toward where Clara had fallen. 3 riders broke off and charged directly at their position. Ethan's revolver was empty. No ammunition, no weapon except the knife on his belt. He grabbed a fallen rifle from a dead settler, tried not to think about who it had belonged to, and fired at the approaching riders. 1 went down. 2 kept coming. Clara struggled to her feet, the satchel secured across her shoulder again, and ran. Not away from the fight, but toward a cluster of wagons where settlers had formed a strong point. Ethan followed, firing the rifle until it clicked empty, then throwing it aside and drawing his knife. One of the riders caught up, leaning from his saddle to grab Clara. Ethan launched himself at the horse, grabbed the rider's leg, and pulled him from the saddle. They hit the ground together, rolling, and Ethan's knife found ribs before the man could draw his pistol. "Keep moving!" Ethan shoved Clara toward the wagons. They made it to the defensive position just as the main assault hit. Continental's riders crashed against the wagon line like a wave against stone, and for terrible minutes everything was smoke and screaming and the wet sounds of bodies breaking. The settlers held, barely. Their defensive positions gave them advantage over mounted attackers, and their desperation gave them ferocity that matched Continental's professional violence. Bodies piled up on both sides. Blood turned the dust to mud. Ethan fought with the knife until his hands were slick with it, until he stopped being able to tell whose blood covered him. Beside him, Clara had found a pistol and was firing with her good hand, each shot deliberate despite the chaos around her. Then, cutting through the gunfire, a different sound emerged. Whistles, dozens of them, coming from the south and east. Continental's riders heard it too and hesitated. The whistles grew louder, closer, and suddenly the darkness erupted with new riders. Not hired guns, but settlers. Families from across Wyoming who'd heard about the gathering and come late, arriving just in time to see Continental's attack. The balance shifted instantly. Continental's men found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, caught between forces that had every reason to show no mercy. Their disciplined attack dissolved into panicked retreat. Scarface tried to rally them, screaming orders, but his men were already fleeing. When Scarface turned his horse to follow the retreat, Ethan saw an opportunity and took it. He ran through the chaos, dodging bodies and bullets, and grabbed Scarface's saddle as the horse bolted past. The momentum nearly tore Ethan's shoulder from its socket, but he held on, pulled himself up behind Scarface, and locked his arm around the man's throat. "Get off!" Scarface tried to shake him loose, but Ethan's grip was iron-forged through weeks of running and fighting and refusing to die quietly. The horse panicked and threw them both. They hit the ground hard, and Ethan's knife was already moving. Scarface blocked with his forearm, grabbed for his pistol with the other hand. They rolled, Scarface's weight advantage giving him leverage, pinning Ethan down with the pistol coming up toward his face. A gunshot cracked, but it wasn't Scarface who fired. Clara stood 5 feet away, smoking pistol in her good hand, face absolutely cold. Scarface slumped sideways with a hole in his chest, dead before he finished falling. Ethan stared up at her, breathing hard. "You okay?" "No." Clara lowered the pistol. Her hand was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "But I'm alive. That's something." Around them, the battle was ending. Continental's surviving men were fleeing into the darkness, while settlers gave chase on horseback. The wounded screamed. The dying were silent. Somewhere a child was crying for a parent who would never answer. The cost had been brutal. Ethan counted at least 40 settlers dead, maybe 60 wounded. Continental's casualties were higher, but that was small comfort to the families who'd lost everything tonight. The older man found them as dawn began breaking. He was bleeding from a dozen places, held together by stubbornness and fury. "We won," he said, though it sounded more like a question. "We survived," Clara corrected. "That's not the same thing." "It's close enough." The older man looked across the carnage. Continental thought they could break us with one decisive attack. Instead, they proved we're willing to die fighting. That changes everything. Clara clutched her satchel, somehow still intact despite everything. The research. We need to get it out. Send copies to newspapers, to territorial offices, to anyone who'll publish it. Already done. The older man smiled grimly. While Continental was attacking, we had writers leaving with copies of your father's maps. By the end of the week, every newspaper from Denver to New York will have documentation of Continental's fraud. They can kill us, but they can't kill the information anymore. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, too many people had died for that, but maybe the beginning of something like vindication. His father's death, Clara's father's murder. All the violence and suffering might actually mean something beyond just more graves. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now, we rebuild. The older man looked toward the horizon where Wyoming stretched endless and unforgiving. We use the water research to establish independent homesteads. We defend each other when Continental retaliates. We prove that cooperation can survive against corporate greed. And when they come back? Claire's voice was steady despite exhaustion. Because they will. This won't end with one battle. Then we fight again. The older man met her eyes. And again. And again. Until they understand that control built on fear eventually collapses when people stop being afraid. Over the next weeks, Claire's prediction proved accurate. Continental retaliated with escalating violence. Homesteads burned, families disappeared, lawyers filed injunctions trying to seize land through legal manipulation. But something had changed fundamentally. The settlers didn't scatter. They gathered together, formed armed cooperatives, defended each other's water rights with the kind of desperate unity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. And the research spread like wildfire. Newspapers east of the Mississippi picked up the story. Corporate corruption, murdered researchers, frontier violence. Some were sympathetic. Others dismissed it as Western lawlessness. But the information was public now, impossible to bury, and that mattered. 6 months after the gathering at Horseshoe Station, territorial investigators arrived in Wyoming. Not because they cared about justice, they'd ignored complaints for years, but because the Eastern newspapers had made Continental's fraud too public to ignore without consequences. The investigation was slow, compromised by bribes and intimidation. But it existed. And for families who'd spent decades being told their suffering didn't matter, even that small acknowledgement felt like victory. Ethan and Clara stayed in Wyoming through it all. They returned to the valley, his father's homestead, and spent months rebuilding what Continental had destroyed. The irrigation channels his father had designed, the water systems that could support dozens of families. It was brutal work. The land fought them the way frontier land always did. Crops failed, equipment broke. Winter came early and nearly killed them both when their shelter collapsed under snow. But they kept building. Other families joined them, drawn by Clara's research and the promise of water that couldn't be monopolized. The valley that had been Thomas Crow's graveyard became something else. A settlement, a community, proof that cooperation could carve survival from harshness. Clara's shoulder never fully healed. Cold weather made it ache, and she couldn't lift anything heavy with her left arm. The scar on her forehead from Scarface's rifle stock remained visible, a permanent reminder of the price she'd paid for her father's research. But she'd wake before dawn anyway, limp down to the spring with her survey equipment, and spend hours documenting water flows and mineral content, building on her father's work, turning his death into something that helped people survive. Ethan found her there one morning, a year after Horseshoe Station, standing beside the spring where they'd first collected samples while Continental's men hunted them. "You're up early," Ethan said. "Couldn't sleep." Clara made notes in her journal, handwriting still shaky but legible. "I keep thinking about my father, about whether he'd be proud or horrified by how this turned out. Both, probably." Ethan sat beside the spring, watching dawn light spread across the valley. "My father was the same way. He wanted to change things, but he'd be horrified by the violence it took to get here. 43 people died at Horseshoe Station." Clara's voice went quiet. "I know their names. Write them down every night so I don't forget. 43 people dead because I convinced them to fight. They chose to fight, same as you, same as me." Ethan took her hand carefully, aware of her injuries. "You didn't kill them. Continental did. Don't let guilt convince you otherwise." Clara was silent for a long moment. Then, "Do you think it was worth it? Everything we lost to get here?" Ethan considered the question honestly, thought about his father bleeding out, about Clara's father murdered for maps, about the 43 names she wrote down every night and the countless others who'd died fighting Continental's greed. I don't know, he admitted. But I know running accomplished nothing except keeping me alive to feel ashamed. And I know the Valley supports 60 families now who would have been driven off their land if your father's research stayed buried. So maybe worth it isn't the right question. What is? Did we do everything we could with what we had? Ethan gestured at the valley around them. The rebuilt irrigation channels, the growing settlement, the children playing near homesteads that 6 months ago didn't exist. My father tried to fight Continental alone and died for it. Your father tried to expose them through legal channels and got murdered. We tried something different. Organized people instead of fighting, isolated, made the information too public to bury. And yeah, people died. But they died choosing to fight instead of waiting to be destroyed anyway. Clara looked across the valley, and something in her expression softened. Not happiness, too much grief remained for that, but maybe the beginning of acceptance that surviving through violence didn't negate the value of what they'd built. Continental's still out there, she said, still controlling judges, still bribing officials. We didn't destroy them. No. But we proved they could bleed, proved that settlers who organize can survive against corporate power. That's not victory, but it's not defeat either. Ethan stood, pulling Clara up with him. And we're still here, still building. That counts for something. They walked back toward the settlement together as the sun climbed higher. Behind them, the spring flowed steady and clear, feeding irrigation channels that spread life across land Continental had tried to keep barren. 3 months later, Continental Cattle Company's territorial operations collapsed under the weight of federal investigations triggered by Clara's research. Several executives were arrested for fraud. Stolen lands were returned to families who'd been driven off. Water rights were reclaimed by independent settlers. It wasn't justice. Too many people had died for that word to mean anything clean. But it was change. Painful, incomplete, built on graves and compromises, but real. The valley settlement thrived. Families arrived from across Wyoming seeking the water security Clara's father had documented. They built homes, planted crops, raised children who would never know the terror of watching their wells run dry while corporations hoarded water rights. Ethan stopped running, stopped looking over his shoulder, waiting for the frontier to catch up with him. The ghost that had haunted him for 6 years, his father's death, his own cowardice, the shame of surviving by hiding, gradually became something else. Not forgotten, but integrated. Part of the foundation he built his life on, instead of the weight that crushed it. Clara never stopped writing her father's research. She expanded his surveys, trained other settlers in irrigation techniques, became the person people traveled hundreds of miles to consult about water systems. The satchel she'd carried through violence stayed with her, but now it held new maps documenting cooperative water networks instead of evidence of corporate crimes. One evening, 2 years after Horseshoe Station, they stood on the porch of the house they'd rebuilt where Thomas Crow had died. The valley spread below them, transformed beyond recognition. Fields green with crops, children playing near the spring, smoke rising from dozens of homesteads scattered across land that used to symbolize only death and failure. "You ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Helping me that day in Dry Creek instead of walking away?" Ethan thought about everything that followed that choice. The violence, the fear, the nights spent running from men with guns, the 43 names Clara wrote down religiously, the permanent ache in her shoulder that cold weather made worse. But he also thought about the valley alive again, about his father's irrigation system feeding families instead of rotting into memory, about Clara beside him, scarred but unbroken, still fighting to make her father's death mean something. "No," Ethan said, "I don't regret it." Clara leaned against him carefully, favoring her injured shoulder. "Liar." "Yeah," Ethan smiled. "But I'm here anyway. That's what matters." The wind that used to carry only dust and despair across Wyoming now carried different sounds. Laughter from the settlement, the splash of water running through irrigation channels, the ordinary noise of people building lives instead of just surviving long enough to die. Ethan had learned something during those brutal months fighting Continental. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to stand your ground after fear had already broken you once. It was accepting that fighting back might cost everything, and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. And standing beside Clara watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Ethan understood that some things couldn't be measured by victory or defeat. His father's dream hadn't been foolish. Clara's father's research hadn't been wasted. The 43 people who died at Horseshoe Station hadn't sacrificed themselves for nothing. They'd all chosen to fight, instead of accepting that power built on cruelty was inevitable. And that choice, multiplied across hundreds of settlers, across months of resistance, across a territory that had almost forgotten what hope looked like, had changed something fundamental. Continental's empire hadn't been destroyed completely. Corruption still existed, violence still erupted. The frontier remained brutal and unforgiving to weakness. But for the first time, people who'd spent their lives being crushed by institutional power understood that organization could survive against it, that sharing resources mattered more than hoarding them, that communities built on cooperation were stronger than isolation enforced by fear. Clara's hand found Ethan's, and they stood together watching their rebuilt valley transform under twilight. Neither of them was the same person who'd met in Dry Creek that violent afternoon. The journey had carved pieces away they'd never recover, had marked them with scars that would ache for the rest of their lives. But they'd also built something from the wreckage. Not perfect, not complete, but real and growing and worth the cost of getting here. The frontier had taught them both that survival sometimes required sacrificing parts of yourself you'd never get back. But it had also taught them something harder and more valuable, that the fight itself mattered even when victory was uncertain, that refusing to accept injustice was its own kind of triumph, regardless of the outcome. As stars began emerging across the Wyoming sky, Ethan thought about his father one last time. Thought about Thomas Crow bleeding out on this porch while his son hid behind a water barrel too terrified to help. He couldn't change that moment. Couldn't undo the cowardice or erase 6 years of running. But he'd returned to the valley anyway. Had fought beside people who chose resistance over surrender. Had helped build something his father would have recognized. A community where water wasn't hoarded, where cooperation defeated greed, where ordinary people proved they could survive without corporate masters controlling their lives. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. Clara looked at him. "For what?" "For riding into Dry Creek carrying impossible dreams and refusing to give up on them, even when it would have been smarter." Ethan squeezed her hand. "For convincing me that fighting back mattered more than staying safe." "We're not safe," Clara pointed out. "We're just alive and still fighting." "Same thing out here." Clara smiled, and it was the first time Ethan had seen that expression reach her eyes since her father died. "Yeah, I suppose it is." They stayed on the porch as night fell completely, watching lights appear in homesteads across the valley. Each one represented families who'd found security because two people had refused to let corporate violence bury the truth. Each one proved that change was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible. The wind carried their voices across the valley, mixing with the sound of water flowing through irrigation channels Thomas Crow had designed, and Clara's father had documented, and Ethan and Clara had rebuilt despite everything trying to stop them. And in that mixing of past and present, of sacrifice and survival, of defeat transformed into something resembling victory, the valley finally became what it was always meant to be. Not a graveyard, not a symbol of frontier brutality, but home.